Next thing that we're reacting to is a video from Space Tomato. So this particular video is called "You'll Never Technically Be 100% Safe in Star Citizen. Is that a problem?" I haven't watched this video yet. I'm kind of interested to see what Space Tomato's actually got to say about this, because he's very open-minded when it comes to this, a lot of this stuff, but he does have a Care Bear leaning. So he's willing to listen to other opinions and stuff like that, but he does like have this leaning towards being a bit more Care Bearish when it comes to the player experience. So if players can have a more positive experience without having to, like go through any sort of suffering, he's a bit more happier to have that happen. And I'm interested in his take here. So let's see what he has to say.
On armistice zones to determine player safety. For the longest time, Star Citizen has depended on armistice zones to determine player safety and rule enforcement. But in the background, security systems have been in development to offer a more immersive, gamified way to do the same thing. Star Citizen's new contested zones have been added to the roadmap for 4.0, and they look to be the first place we'll see some form of these security systems in testing. These locations look a lot like the dark zones in the Division series by Massive Entertainment. By manipulating power and doors in an abandoned part of the space stations of Pyro, players can battle constantly active NPCs and potentially other players to hold locations and find new types of loot. These new contested zones could be the site of the most exciting and, of course, most marketable gameplay Star Citizen offers so far. But with Star Citizen's glitchy nature also opens players up for some pretty disappointing scenarios. And yes, it is more combat in Star Citizen, but they do represent a much needed gameplay expansion to the game. Let's talk about these locations and what they mean for the more risky players among us. Let us start the new hype season for 4.0 for the 6th time.
I'm glad he's keeping track of that. That's actually like a really good introduction there though, like on the contested zones. Probably the best introduction actually I've heard about it. It's interesting that he mentioned the stuff from last year's CitizenCon, I believe it was, with being able to interact with other parts of the station. This video was made before the most recent Star Citizen Live about contested zones. I wish I'd watched it now, because I'm curious to know if the devs mentioned, like having to activate or like go and fix something in the station in order to gain access to the contested zone and activate it. He mentions it there, and it would make sense to have that sort of functionality, but don't think that was CIG's intent. Also, the automated turrets, like they've got the stuff there, but they haven't activated it yet. So, and it may be a while before they do, because it's all linked to performance. Server performance is the key for these systems actually functioning well. So like, they've got them there. Whether or not they work will be dependent on the server, or it wouldn't be work, it'd be effective. So the most effective thing right now to do is just have a hard armistice zone where you can't do the things, you can't listen to those little voices in your head and do the fun things that you want to do in those heavily populated areas. But yeah, let's keep going.
Thank you for coming to my Tomato Talk.
You're welcome.
Before we truly get into things, if you're looking for more in-depth discussions about these topics, criticisms, praises, and interesting points, I host a podcast with a new guest every week from the community to discuss Star Citizen, No Man's Sky, Star Wars Outlaws, and other space games in their development. It's on the second channel, Space Tomato 2, which I have linked down below for you. Now, so the basic explanation of how these contested zones work is this. Pyro space stations will have abandoned sections with sporadic power and access. You'll be able to leave the armistice protected social areas and enter these free-for-all areas that feature multiple paths, NPCs that will essentially live in these areas and respawn over time if killed, security systems, other players, and the most valuable loot likely in the game. Not only are these areas hosted in stations that you may have trouble accessing due to reputation, they are also in the Pyro system. Pyro isn't completely lawless. The gangs keep some form of peace that they have to agree on, but it is certainly more dangerous than Stanton, and these locations are at the end of the yellow brick road of nonsense that is the online gaming community. So once you get into these places, likely with the group, you'll need to navigate what we've found to be much more vertically inclined space stations than we've known. There will be hazards like mines and security turrets, but also a lot of places for platforming, climbing, jumping, crawling, and finding alternate routes to get around blocked paths. This essentially is an extraction shooter scenario. What you find in the zone, if CIG is doing this right, could potentially be your next favorite weapon, or an actual trophy you can go back to Stanton and show off to your friends in your new personal hangar. A sign that you went into the storm to weather the most violent, broken AI and the most annoying players in the game, rather than simply subscribing for a nice paint. No offense, annoying is good in this scenario. You gotta get your booty. Now, as you can see, these being space stations means that most of the combat is going to be pretty close quarters. No vehicles, limited snipers, and not much opportunity for threats to come out of nowhere besides, hiding. With no artificial matchmaking or player limits, there's no knowing how this plays out until it actually happens. It'll likely be kind of chaos, but the team still has a lot of control over how it plays out with all these natural gates to access. Hopefully, the different areas and space stations have some actual diversity, considering the space stations in Pyro supposedly have some variety, but I wouldn't expect major differences between the locations just yet, personally. This whole system is all very dependent on the resource network, which is mainly associated with ships, as that's really all we've ever seen it with.
Where the fuck is he getting this take from? Like, they don't mention this in the ISC at all. This just seems like he's inferring this. Problem is like, this sounds like he's going to present it as fact. Like, I'm not going to lie, I hope it is. I hope they actually implement the stuff that he's about to go into, which is essentially going to be like, you got to go fix or repair something, you got to go exchange something to activate access to these contested zones. But I don't believe it was CIG's intent that you had to do this to access them to start off with. And at this point in time, when CIG had released the video on the contested zones, I don't believe they mentioned anything about this. I want to know where he's getting this information from, and maybe we just need to keep watching to see if he states that he's inferring this or if he has an alternate source. I don't know.
Besides a couple teasers here and there, but it will function in space stations, outposts, and cities as well. Basically anywhere there are resources. If CIG really does tie this system into the controls, we may see more options added to these areas over time as resources develop that allow us to get a little strategic. And interestingly, in the preview, we do actually see mention of atmosphere scrubbers, so there may be potential to play with the life support in these areas as well, as many of them do have life support turned off by default. Along with resource management, security terminals will also be accessible through the use of security cards and possibly codes that are retrieved from NPCs in the areas. Once you've retrieved these cards though, you'll need to make sure the sweaties don't get you. Now of course you could come across the loot of these locations in somebody else's inventory down the line if you're that kind of player. We are playing a full loot game after all. But these locations are actually introducing a real goal for players, a reason to go to a location and strategize in order to achieve a goal, and a situation that pits the most violent players up against each other to have a little more fun. Combined with fully persistent NPC enemies, all of this is something Star Citizen has basically never had before, other than in Security Post Korea with its crime stat hacking feature, which is pretty limited in size and availability. The disappointing thing about this whole system though, and a lingering major problem with the game at large, is all you need to do to get away from danger in these areas is step back through a door into the armistice zone.
Yeah, but you gotta be near that door. Like if you're deep in the contested zone, it's like you've got to fight your way out. I don't know where he's going with this, because this just doesn't seem, this particular point that he's trying to make, I don't understand. Like, oh yeah, like you can just step out of the contested zone back into the armistice zone and you'll be fine. It's like, no, only if you're like next to the door. You're like deep inside the contested zone, you've got to try and fight your way to it. Bit of a weird take. Let's see where he takes us with it.
Just like how in the Stanton system, all you need to do to escape a bounty is go to a landing zone. As I said at the beginning of the video, armistice zones are necessary at the moment because security systems, NPCs, and reputation are still not developed enough to offer in-game natural methods of deterrence and consequence to bad actors. A lot of this really comes down to the fact that the back-end and networking side of this game can't keep up with everything, but we also just need to see a big expansion on development with the reputation system. This really holds Star Citizen back from a more immersive experience and a system of action and consequence. Especially in a system like Pyro, where we're heavily dependent on the reputation system with gangs and the danger of no overarching government entity, armistice zones feel even more artificial. In the Stanton system, a bounty hunter should be able to earn the trust of the guild and local authorities to carry a non-lethal gun into the city to track down their target and subdue them, but that's just not possible with the current limitations. And that, overall, is a problem for the game.
Like, They just haven't developed it yet. They haven't gotten to that point. The audience that he's like aiming this towards more for people that don't really pay close attention to Star Citizen's official content releases. He's trying to make it more digestible, but the stuff that he's pulling together for this, like, I was going to pause him when he was talking about how security systems aren't working, but then he mentions, you know, ultimately comes down to server performance, and I was like, yes, that's exactly right. The same point that I was making in the previous reaction with Avenger 1, where he's saying, oh, you know, like the defense systems aren't up to par and CIG needs to iterate on them. It's like, how about we get server meshing first and the server's better performant, because when you're on a server that's running at 30 frames a second, those things shit on you. They will shit on you like you're nothing, and we should see the servers improve in performance. But in this case here, with what Space Tomato is saying, it's like they just haven't gotten to that point in the development yet. Like, they need the servers to be more performant before they can really take those next steps and implement, like, start dialing back the armistice zones from hard armistice zones to soft ones. Like, there's something that I don't think a lot of people understand is CIG isn't going to get rid of armistice zones. Like, you're not going to have a station where you're going to be able to go there and it's like a free-for-all, but it's still under control of a group. There'll still be that soft armistice zone, but it's only there as an extra layer for the jurisdiction to apply more penalties to you. So, you know, violating the armistice zone by attacking someone in it. You'll still be able to, like, pull out, you know, guns and things like that and use them and, you know, try and sneak guns into different areas. But if you get caught using it, it just results in extra charges and extra punishments that can be stacked up against you. So when people keep saying, you know, like, the armistice zones are going to go away, no, they're not. They will still be around. It just won't be an armistice zone that restricts you from doing things. It'll just be an extra layer of punishment.
I do hope as we approach the launch of this update, CIG reiterates if this is how they want things to be long term, or if they are sticking to the idea of more natural methods of controlling player behavior. It's a big sticking point for many players and a main topic I did discuss with University of Stanton on my podcast this week. Link to that is down below. All that being said, this kind of gameplay, as I covered in a recent video, is entirely disconnected from what many players come to Star Citizen for. While these aren't on-the-rails missions, they are a continuation of a combat focus. This is not necessarily the gameplay for me, but coming from an FPS background, I do enjoy some pew-pew. Regardless, I am mostly here to advocate for the explorers, the foragers, and those looking to peacefully search for and exploit valuables around the verse. Pyro is not the end of this game's development. Considering the state of the game engine, really this is almost the beginning of the actual game being built. Thanks, Squadron 42. What I do hope to start seeing more of is the social and creative aspects of Star Citizen, utilizing the star map, the upcoming quantum travel changes, and the various points of interest being introduced to the game. Now, we do have a look into the social aspects of Pyro coming up soon, but I can't wait for it to become more of a main point of communication with the company. The first thing I did see when previewing these abandoned locations last year at CitizenCon was an opportunity for exploration, for searching the long abandoned areas of Pyro that may be risky to reach, but allow for some in-depth treasure hunting. Ultimately, as the game does progress and expand, these locations will naturally have less players looking to kill you and more opportunities for you to just platform and find the most valuable things. As long
This is actually something in the Pyro playtest that I actually did a fair bit of, like just exploring the different stations. It was interesting the way that they had laid them out. You know, I found in one area, on one station, I found an elevator that took me to like this engineering zone, and there was an airlock that led outside, but I don't think the interior of the station was supposed to be with the exterior of the station, so the geometry didn't match up, because the airlock that I found that was supposed to take me outside had this exterior geometry there that covered up the airlock door. So I'm pretty sure that the interior wasn't actually supposed to be for that station. It was interesting because it was like, oh, I just found, you know, an external entrance that you can use to get into the station where you don't have to call up the ATC. And something that, you know, like he doesn't mention it, but the exterior of the stations don't have turrets everywhere. They do have turrets, but they're not everywhere. And this particular place where I saw this alternate entrance didn't have turrets near it. So you could get dropped off near that, go EVA, get into the station, go through the contested zone, and then go into the main bazaar areas. So if you didn't have the reputation to get past the guards at the front, you had a method of being able to get into the station. I do agree with his point though, where he's talking about like Pyro feels like the game becoming more like a game. Although I was saying before when we got the UI update, you know, the new HUD, the new map, new mobiGlas, that Star Citizen was already starting to feel more like a game, which is good. Like, I'm liking it. But in terms of like things to do, Pyro brings in like this slew of new content in terms of like areas that you can go to. When it comes to variety of things that you can do, it's still going to be the same sort of thing, like salvaging, mining, cargo hauling, piracy, bounty hunting, PMC missions and all that sort of stuff. But it's in a different environment. You may have to deal with different threats, like we've got the solar flares from fucking Pyro, so you'll get flashbang every now and again. You end up in this different environment with a different rule set, and it's got a different vibe about it. Whereas if you go to Stanton, it's going to feel different there again, in that it's a lot more controlled, a bit restrictive in some places. Whereas in Pyro, it's like open and free and chaotic. So like, it's one of the things that I'm looking forward to there. But I think the exploration side of things, like you can already do that now. The problem is like people, when it comes to exploration, is they're expecting, like they want to know that there's going to be something at the end, as opposed to going out and climbing a hill for the sake of climbing a hill. You know, but I think that's what CIG needs to, you know, introduce to say, you know, satisfy those explorers. They need to like tell them, hey, there's things there that you can find, but you're gonna have to look for them. These are the sorts of things that you'll find. They've shown us a pyro crab a couple of years ago. We haven't heard anything about it since. One of the planets of Pyro may have pyro crabs on it that, you know, you won't find until you start exploring the caves.
As long as they don't start marking areas around the game as contested PvP capable areas, I think that should be something that more naturally presents itself. And I do think those things are coming, but until features like FPS scanning, quantum boosting, and a more robust selection of props, loot, and the associated art from the studio are in the game, they will continue to depend on combat features to build interesting gameplay scenarios. What we're seeing with Pyro is a mixture of gameplay that leans more into aggression, but I do think it'll offer a challenge for the players willing to defend themselves, but not necessarily get into combat on their own. When we start seeing more of that in development and coming to the game, I'll be right here to let you know, but until then, these seem to be Star Citizen's own dark zones coming in Alpha 4.0. Thanks for watching this video. I'm more focused on quicker news drops for you all now as a mix between my feature watches and tomato talks, and I'll continue to develop this format until I think it fits what I'd like. As always, I'd love to hear what you think of them, and let me know what you think of these new locations coming to 4.0. And if you'd like to support these videos, get more in-depth monthly exclusives about the history.
I think he's just gone into the advertisements side of things. I'll encourage you guys to go and watch it. Hard to get excited for the bulk of this before it gets here in April, but I do like the concept CIG has suggested. Yeah, we're getting 4.0 this year. Probably the fucking tech preview channel. That's where we'll probably get it. Right now I get this is what we want to do vibe, rather than this is done and ready. I didn't see any gameplay footage that couldn't be considered copy paste from anywhere. Well, that's the thing though, is like with what the contested zones are supposed to represent, what new gameplay does CIG really need to introduce, or what new features does CIG need to introduce to make that a possibility? Like the areas on those stations already exist. They just need to put the AI in there. Yeah, they just need to put the AI in there, and then put some loot boxes in there, and maybe if they want to add missions they could do that too. But they've already got existing missions that they can add there. So like, it's par for the course from CIG really to say this is what we want to do, because they're still building it out. But the contested zones are something that they could take, you know, existing mechanics and just implement and go, hey, you know, done. 12 years cautious now. Yeah, I get what you mean though, Soil. Like with what has been going on in terms of CIG showing us, hey, this is what we want to do, and then when we get in our hands we're like, what the fuck is this? But like with what they've shown so far of the contested zones, like I guess they could have done a playthrough, but even then, like with a playthrough, what are they showing in the contested zones that you wouldn't see or wouldn't look familiar to what we already can do now at a place like Security Post Korea? Like other than the locations, you know, like being closer to a respawn point, what can they do to convince us like, hey, this is actually something that we've already done and, you know, it's ready to go? Because you're right, they could just put a video together of them doing different things in PvP and, you know, throw some creatures in there and some AI and just show contested zones at the bottom. throw in loot boxes and shit like that and go, hey, you know, this is a thing. When I was exploring that abandoned section where the contested zones are going to be, on some of the stations, I was finding loot boxes and they were full of like food and weapons and ammo. So that is going to be a thing, but that's no different to what you would find in bunkers, right? So like, see what COG has done. The contested zones is like an easy win, really. They can take the existing mechanics, turn it into a game, and then go, hey, or a game mode that you can play straight away. Go, hey, there you go. And I don't think they need to show much more. And they'll probably just implement the bare bones for it. So tier 0 contested zones, and then after that, see how the players go, and then make adjustments from there. Yeah, I was hoping that Space Tomato video was going to be a bit more opinion based, but it seems like that one, like as he said at the end, it's just informative. Some of the stuff that he was saying though, I don't know where he was getting the information from. It looked like he was piecing together different things that are being discussed and saying, yeah, like this is relevant to this, and it's like kind of it is, but COG didn't mention it when they were talking about this particular thing. I see the connection that you can make, like for a news-based thing. It seems like he's just put things together and gone, yeah, this is news. And it's like, the OG didn't mention this other thing, not in conjunction with this. I get what you mean, mate. I get it. I hope they do it. But when reporting news, accuracy is important. And the problem is like, when you are reporting news, people will see what you've got to say. And if they're not tracking the official stuff coming from CIG, they'll take what you say as gospel. And then we end up in this situation where it ends up being, you know, that game of telephone where the message is one thing at the start and ends up being something completely different at the end. And nobody's intentionally changing things on purpose, or some people might be, but people will tack on their little extra bit, or they'll say something different and it's interpreted differently the next time somebody says the same thing.